Hello, this is RPTV News and my name is Dmitry Martinovich. Today on RPTV News, we turn once more on matters that are underscored by the COVID-19 pandemic. In the area of Regent Park, Moss Park, and north to Bloor Street, the rise of tents and cardboard shelters in parks, under bridges, and sometimes in storefront doorways has pitted a growing number of street and homeless people against homeowners, businesses, and the City of Toronto. Our guest today is Kathleen Smith, who is the Donor Relations Coordinator for Sanctuary Toronto, a non-profit organization that runs a drop-in center for street and homeless people. Let's join Kathleen now as she talks about the challenges that are faced by those that are homeless during this most unprecedented of times. Hello, Kathleen, and welcome to RPTV. So today we're going to be speaking to you about the recent phenomenon of encampments that is making its presence felt all around the city in parks, under bridges, sometimes in storefront doorways. But before we begin with all of that, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the organization that you work for, Sanctuary Toronto, what you do, and the kinds of populations that you serve.
Thank you for having me. So Sanctuary has been operating for around 28 years now. We are a long-standing presence in the neighborhood. So we are located just south of the intersection of Yonge and Bloor. We're on Charles Street, and we describe ourselves as a community where people who are poor and excluded are particularly valued. And so what that means in practice is that we do offer a lot of different resources and programs. So we have, under ordinary circumstances, we have meal programs, we operate a healthcare clinic, we have arts programming, we also offer shower facilities, clothes, access to phones and Wi-Fi. But the most important thing that we do is to be a space where people are recognized for their fundamental human dignity, and where we build friendships and deep relationships with people, because that's often something that a lot of folks who end up unhoused or on the street, they often, for whatever reason, there can be lots of reasons, lack those supportive relationships that can help them to care well for themselves and to live a dignified, flourishing life. So we see people kind of from across the spectrum of poverty. We do see many people who sleep rough, meaning people who sleep outside, people who stay in the shelter or respite systems. There are also quite a few people who are part of the sanctuary community who are housed, but maybe sort of underhoused. So that might mean that they're in a precarious housing situation. Maybe they are squatting, or in other cases, it's simply people who are living in poverty, who lack access to essential resources or to community and companionship, and we offer that as well.
Thank you, Kathleen. I wonder if you could describe to us the situation that homeless people are facing today with COVID-19.
One of the important things to acknowledge is that people who are homeless or street involved in Toronto, they were facing a crisis before COVID-19 started. Shelters were over full. There were many, many, many times when myself and other outreach workers at Sanctuary and other organizations would try to get people spaces in shelters, and it just wasn't possible. There were no options for them. So basically what COVID-19 has done is it has exacerbated an existing crisis that's been brewing really over the past 30 years of underinvestment in affordable housing and other critical community resources. So as soon as all initial closures happened as a result of COVID, one of the things that happened is that the city went from having around 59, 60 drop-in centers, which are spaces where people who are homeless or street involved or living in poverty come to access things like food, things like showers. For a long time, there were only 10 throughout the entire city of Toronto. One of the other things that happened is that all public spaces closed, including bathrooms. And so people without housing had nowhere to use the washroom. Sanctuary has ended up having to put porta potties in our parking pad because at one point there were some porta potties installed by the city, but the closest was a 15 to 20-minute walk. And if you have to go, sometimes you have to go. So we had to take action there. It increased isolation because you couldn't come to these sort of ordinary gathering places, and obviously all kinds of gatherings were discouraged. And if you're homeless, you don't have access often to the kinds of technology that allows you to communicate with people, to stay in touch. Being homeless and living in poverty is really stressful. And there are there's a lot of trauma associated with that, a lot of difficulty. So all of us need support, community, connection, essential resources. But then to lack those and also be dealing with the trauma and the stress of being homeless, the effects have been really brutal.
Thank you, Kathleen. I wonder if you could take some time to speak about what kind of support you've received from the City of Toronto with respect to the work that you're doing.
So Sanctuary doesn't receive funding from the City of Toronto or from any level of government, actually, except for our healthcare clinic, which does receive funding from the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. So again, it's a difficult question to answer because the support we've received has been fairly minimal. I think that's fair to say. So the city does fund shelters, and we, along with other advocates in the city, have been pushing for as soon as this started, that we needed to implement social distancing in shelters, and we needed to get people into hotel spaces where they could have their own bathroom, they could have a door that closed, you can physically distance, it's dignified, it's safe. The city took 10 weeks to start implementing adequate physical distancing in shelters, and not quite that long, but they waited weeks to get people into hotels, and that has still been very, very slow. So we haven't seen the city respond to this for what it is, which is an emergency. It's a crisis. If a building is burning down, and you say your fastest possible response, oh, well, we can only respond to that maybe in a week, in 2 weeks, we're doing our best. Well, it's an emergency. The house is burning down right now. And so we have not seen the city responding to this as though it were an emergency. It's been a challenge. The city is now, as I mentioned, taking steps to implement physical distancing in shelters, but they did have to be compelled to do that by legal action.
So in terms of the protocols that you have to follow in your day-to-day work, who are you taking direction from? Are you working with the city, or are you following the guidelines from other health authorities?
Sure, yeah. So obviously we're bound by any legislation in place. So we are an essential service, so we are allowed to be open, and we don't have the same restrictions around gatherings, although we are restricting our numbers to be in line with the rules put in place by the province. We have implemented our own protocols as guided by the medical team that we have on staff, and they've been guided by the CDC and WHO and other public health bodies. So we've had, from the day that it was announced that it was officially a pandemic, we've had measures in place. We've been doing screenings at the door, screenings for temperature and symptoms, and before people were allowed to enter the building, and that includes staff. We have also radically changed the way that we are offering drop-ins in community spaces. So now, instead of our usual activities, we have 4 weekly meal drop-ins, because access to food is a huge issue for people who are homeless and for people who are poor and have limited access to delivery services and things like that. So we went from offering from serving 300 meals a week to serving around 600. And most of those meals we serve as takeout meals that people can access sort of outside. They come outside, they can grab their meal and leave so that they don't have to be exposed to too many people. But we are on a limited basis allowing people inside. So we are allowing up to 5 people to come downstairs, and they can eat downstairs if they would like to. They can also use the washroom, shower, and 2 days a week access care from our medical team. We have also been offering our space upstairs for up to 5 people with sleeping mats and blankets and pillows for people to stay, because it's a really stressful, difficult time. It's hard to get enough sleep if you're out on the streets. And so we've been offering that space. So the highest number of people who are inside accessing resources at any given time is 10, which is the big change for us. Many nights, particularly on Thursday nights, which have historically been our busiest nights, we'll have, we'll see 150, 200 people, and many of them will be inside at the same time. So it's changed a lot. Staff also, in terms of protocols, staff are also wearing full personal protective equipment. So gowns, gloves, mask, and a face shield or goggles. And we also, at the start of this, divided our staff team in 2. So what that means is that the 2 teams, Team A and Team B, are not interacting with each other at all. So if one person on Team A is tests positive for COVID, then Team B can continue to operate and work, and vice versa.
Indeed, those are difficult circumstances, to be sure. Can you take a moment and try to explain to us what sorts of advice and guidelines you are giving or giving to homeless people during this COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so if you have access to good hand washing and hand sanitizer, that's really important. Especially important to not touch your face. That's important for all of us, but if you don't have access to good, I think mostly what we've been doing is trying to encourage people to be attentive to any symptoms. It is a bit of a struggle because many of the people we work with are long-term smokers, and so they have a long-term smoker's cough. It can be hard to identify when that changes into something a little bit different. But yeah, we've been encouraging people to be attentive to those symptoms, and the city has set up a special program for people who don't have housing if they test positive. So there is a hotel space where they can isolate, and there's transportation to get them to a testing site. So we have been able to access that and tell people about those resources. One of the things that we have been doing is we have been giving out tents in a way that we don't normally do. We might have done that very rarely, and it would have been tents that have been donated to us sort of maybe 1 or 2 at a time in the past. But now we are actually intentionally and en masse giving out tents, because up until now, they have been the safest option for people. If you have your own tent, you can socially isolate, or you can do sort of a family group isolation with maybe 2 or 1 or 2 other people. And in shelters, in most shelters, it wasn't possible to physically distance, and you would be sharing facilities and all that kind of thing. So we had been doing that. The city is now required to start implementing adequate physical distancing in shelters, and they are going to be offering more spaces in hotels and other forms of accommodation, because the shelter system can't actually accommodate everyone who needs spaces there. So hopefully, increasingly, we'll be able to direct people to shelters that are safe and to the hotels or other accommodations that the city is offering. But for now, tents.
Yes, these are very difficult times. On the one hand, you have this growing population of street and homeless people living in tents and shelters, and you have this huge array of organizations, nonprofits, different organizations that are geared to trying to help vulnerable populations. And at the same time, you have the city who is involved in dismantling all of these encampments and forcing people who are living on the street in shelters, in their homemade shelters, to move on. How do you reconcile these two opposing views?
That has been a challenge. You're absolutely right about that. I think one of the difficulties in particular has been that the city's communication has been pretty inconsistent about what they were going to do. The CDC and other bodies have said that until the pandemic is over, encampments should not be cleared. For many of the reasons that I just discussed, because they're often the safest option for people. And the United Nations has actually recently drafted a statement on the rights of people who live in encampments. In other parts of the world, we call them slums. So initially, the city of Toronto said that they were going to abide by the CDC recommendations. They are not going to clear encampments. Then that changed, and it wasn't totally clear why that had changed. We had the experience at Sanctuary. There's an encampment in our backyard and in the adjacent park, George Hislop Park. And about, I think 3 weeks ago now, 31 people who were in the park and in our backyard were given access to temporary housing, which was great. That the city had organized. And so we collaborated with the city and Streets to Homes workers to move those people there. So that was great. But there were quite a few people left behind in the encampment who had not been offered spaces. There weren't enough spaces. And the city gave them eviction notices, which we understood to be contradictory to what the city had said they were going to be doing. They said they were going to be following the CDC recommendations. And since then, there's been similar confusion at a number of other sites under the Gardner, and in other parts of the city where some people have been offered spaces, not everyone has been offered spaces, but they still decide to clear the encampment. And that's a work in progress, trying to communicate with the city and figure out sort of what their guidelines and directives are. And also, Sanctuary, along with many other advocates, are fighting really hard to make sure that if an encampment is cleared, which we're not encouraging, that everyone there is offered a real safe alternative. So we are not considering a space in a shelter where there isn't physical distancing. We're not considering that a safe option because it isn't. So it would have to be a hotel or a shelter space where there is physical distancing in place.
Well, it turns out that the actions of the city are sometimes confusing because they are, on the one hand, saying that when they come upon people in an encampment sleeping outside, they are offering them some kind of accommodation before they dismantle their camps. But at the same time, they are not giving up on the project that they have in terms of clearing the parks, the under bridges. So in view of all of that, let me ask you how you're doing with respect to your neighbors. You were saying that in the back of your building you have a small encampment and in your yard. Can you speak to me about that?
I would say that has been a mixed bag. We are fortunate to have, quite a few people in the neighborhood who are really supportive of the work we're doing, and also supportive of the community in tents, people who have donated money, people who have donated food. So that's been really wonderful to see, that rallying of support. But that support has certainly not been universal. Some people have really strong objections to the encampment. And I think one of the things that this has done is that, the people who are staying in these encampments, I would say almost without exception, they weren't housed before COVID-19 started. They were homeless. They were couch surfing. They were in shelters, whatever. Some of them were in encampments that were maybe more isolated, less out in the open, but they existed. They were there, and this was their life before COVID-19. And now all those challenges have been exacerbated. What's happening now is that more people, it's becoming more visible. Mm-hmm. Their lives are becoming more visible. And I think what we are trying to do our best as people who do outreach work to communicate to neighbors who might have problems with the encampment is that the problem is not that there is now an encampment in your backyard. The problem is that there are thousands of people in one of the wealthiest cities in the world without housing. And I think a lot of people do see that, but there's an initial shock because they just, they weren't aware because it wasn't visible to them before.
So yes, and this is even made worse by the fact that there are laws that empower the city to be able to fine people who are living on the street, and once people are charged with something, they get sucked up into the criminal justice system, and their lives, which are precarious as it is, become even worse.
I think that sometimes what happens is that in a neighborhood where there hasn't previously been encampments, one crops up and people think, oh my gosh, what's going on here? But really, this is actually part of something that's happening across the city, across our country, and across the world. And I think appreciating the global context is really important. And it shows that it's not tied to, one individual person or any individual person who's staying in one of these tents. This is a symptom of a much, broader disease than something that is happening in one neighborhood. And the disease is that we are not offering housing to people, that there are no affordable housing options, that there are no safe, dignified places for people to stay. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Certainly government underinvestment is one, certainly in the Canadian context. And so it has been a struggle though. There's a lot of opposition to the encampments, and a lot of I haven't witnessed a lot of physical violence, but certainly a lot of contempt, a lot of abusive language being directed at people who are really just trying to survive.
Yes, visibility is certainly a deciding factor, because most people are not prepared to accept or allow something so unusual as people camping out in public in tents and cardboard shelters that they've made.
Yeah, so I think that there is this long-standing, sometimes spoken, sometimes unspoken assumption that public space is not for people who are poor or unhoused. Certainly even before COVID, a lot of people in our community had the experience of, say, being in a park, being somewhere, sitting on the sidewalk and being moved along from that space, or maybe sitting in a somewhere in a mall and being moved along from that space in a way that if I were occupying that space, I probably wouldn't be moved along that way. Mm-hmm. And now with the encampments, obviously that is dialed right up, because, as you talk about aesthetics, so for many people visually, this is just really not what they want to see in their park. And so, and again, their park, but so there's this really strong opposition to people's presence in spaces that really are public. And the public is everyone. It's people who are housed, it's people who are unhoused. And there's often talk about, residents suffering because there are encampments. Well, the people in the encampments are they're residents too. They're members of the community as well. And I think unarguably, they are actually the residents who are suffering the most because of these circumstances, because of all of the things that fuel the existence of encampments in the first place. So I think we try really hard to shift the conversation to include everyone in the community. So you're part of the community, you're a resident, whether you're staying in a tent on sanctuary property or whether you are in the penthouse condo next door.
Yes, for most people, it's a matter of aesthetics, and this is the tents and the homemade shelters that are cropping up everywhere look messy. They would be described as unsightly. There's sort of garbage that stacks up around them, and generally people are disturbed by them.
Yeah, so I think that there is this long-standing, sometimes spoken, sometimes unspoken assumption that public space is not for people who are poor or unhoused. Like certainly even before COVID, a lot of people in our community had the experience of, say, being in a park, being somewhere, sitting on the sidewalk and being moved along from that space, or maybe sitting in a somewhere in a mall and being moved along from that space in a way that if I were occupying that space, I probably wouldn't be moved along that way. Mm-hmm. And now with the encampments, obviously that is dialed right up because, as you talk about aesthetics, so for many people visually, this is just really not what they want to see in their park. And so, and again, their park, but so there's this really strong opposition to people's presence in spaces that really are public. And the public is everyone. It's people who are housed, it's people who are unhoused. And there's often talk about, residents suffering because there are encampments. Well, the people in the encampments are they're residents too. They're members of the community as well. And I mean, I think unarguably, they are actually the residents who are suffering the most because of these circumstances, because of all of the things that fuel the existence of encampments in the first place. So I think we try really hard to shift the conversation to include everyone in the community. So you're part of the community, you're a resident, whether you're staying in a tent on sanctuary property or whether you are in the penthouse condo next door.
Well, thank you very much, Kathleen. Just wondering if there's anything else you would like to say with respect to the work your organization is doing and your sense of what the homeless community is facing now during COVID-19.
I think what I would want to say is that I think in media, we often get bombarded with a very particular kind of image of a person who is homeless. And often that is someone who is frightening, someone who is different, someone who is behaving strangely. And if it's not that, it's often someone who is sort of only a person who has lots of needs and is really vulnerable. And certainly a lot of the people in our community are vulnerable. There are mental health challenges. There are struggles with violence because people are desperate and suffering. But there's also another side to any person and to our community. So I think since COVID has started, I have witnessed incredible generosity and incredible grace from people in the homeless community. So I think of one night in particular, we had given out all of our tents. We didn't have any left, and someone came asking and needing them. And she was in a really vulnerable situation. And someone else gave her his tent. So he was going to sleep on the ground that night because he felt like her need was greater in that moment. And one of our first drop-ins under COVID, someone came in and he was in line to get inside. He was in a really bad way. His housing situation was just really, really dangerous and distressing to him. And he wanted to come inside so that he could speak to someone and just get some peace. And he let 10 people go in ahead of him. It was his turn. And he let 10 people go ahead because he felt like, no, you need it more than I do. You need it more than I do. And so I think, it's just people who are homeless, this seems obvious, but they're human beings with gifts and strengths and the capacity for generosity and to give so much. And I just think, it's important for us all to see that.
Thank you, Kathleen. The circumstances of those who are homeless and those who cannot find shelter and those who have been forced to live in tents for lack of any other means is indeed a matter of concern for everyone, but disturbingly one that has been exacerbated by the coronavirus. My name is Dimitri Martinovic, and you've been watching RPTV News. Join us again as we continue to report on stories and issues that are of critical importance to our communities.
Like, share, and subscribe to our channel. For more information, follow us on all our social media platforms. And don't forget to visit our website, as well as comment down below what you thought about this video.